I am Dr. Sharon Austin, Professor of Political Science at the University of Florida and a proud graduate of the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, where I received a doctorate in political science in 1993 that transformed my life in many ways and also allowed me to influence the lives of my students and colleagues in a positive way over the years. Today I am joined by Mr. Mike Green. He is a cultural economist, entrepreneur, and economic strategist who is also a pioneer of inclusive competitiveness strategies that are designed to improve the economic productivity of underrepresented populations. In 2017, he published The Future Economy and Inclusive Competitiveness: How Demographic Trends and Innovation Can Create Prosperity for All Americans. In 2019, Mr. Green launched the How to Talk to Kids About Race in America workshop. Currently, he is the Chief Strategist for the National Institution for Institutional Competitiveness, or the NIIC. As its president and CEO, Mr. Green manages to work with HBCUs, national foundations, and Fortune 500 corporations to develop key initiatives for the NIIC to improve the productivity of America's most vulnerable populations. He is also the co facilitator for Inclusive America, Common Ground Conversations on Race in America, that convinces individuals, organizations, and institutions to engage in productive dialogue and to design policies that lead to building a more inclusive America. First, I'd like to ask you to start off by telling our viewers and listeners a little bit about your background and upbringing. Where does your story start for you?
Well, it's a good question. My story starts on the edge of a diving board at a public pool at age 12 years old. And I had watched other kids jump off that diving board. Some of them walk back and swim, moving their arms and legs to the side. Now, I thought, if they can do it, I can do it. So I got on the edge of that diving board, and keep in mind, there were no prerequisites. No one told me that you needed to know how to swim to jump off that diving board into 10 feet of water. And so my first revelation was when I got in that water and realized you really need to know how to swim to do this. Now, I managed to make it to the other side, but that taught me the first lesson. The second lesson was when I was 14 years old, and my mother, who was raising 5 kids by herself in the South in the 60s, she had a standard in her home. And that standard was you could not speak the language of the streets in my mother's home. You could not. But the streets had their own standard, and you could not speak the white man's language in the streets and survive. So we learned how to code switch very, very quickly. And at the same time, my mother told me that if you wanted to play football, then you're going to have to be as competitive in the classroom as you are on the field. And so she tricked me. She made me take this little test, and that little test got me onto a little yellow bus. And that little yellow bus took me to places that I would never have seen or known about had I not been on that little yellow bus. Every summer, I went to a science and math institute across the city. And when I got there, it was basically another high school that I had never heard of, never seen, but it was set in a forest-like setting. And when the trees parted and you saw this big palace-looking building, it's like the angels were singing and you arrived at heaven. What I learned in those 2 summers at that Science and Math Institute set me on a career path academically for success in high school. And I learned more in those 2 summers than I did in 4 years of high school. And I realized the revelation to me was that they were teaching white kids, the kids that are going to compete with me, they were teaching them something different than what my academic career would have otherwise taught me had I not had an exposure to what they were being taught. So I realized that we were living in 2 separate and unequal societies. I was 16 years old when I realized that. And at one point I asked my mother, I said, Mom, I don't have anybody I can talk to. And she said to me the 2 words that have stuck with me throughout my whole life. She said, I know.
Wow.
From that point forward, I realized I was in a world by myself. And either I was going to succeed or I was going to fail, but nobody really cared. And that was a revelation to me. That little yellow bus opened my eyes. The next time I had my eyes open, I had left the University of Houston and joined the military. I joined the Navy as a propulsion engineer. My scores, because I'm a very good test taker, my mama said, you're going to be competitive on the field, you will be competitive in the classroom. So I did very well on the tests, and they offered me an opportunity to be a nuclear engineer. And because I'm colorblind, I couldn't be a nuclear engineer, but I became a propulsion engineer instead. And I went through all of their academic protocol as either the number one or number two in my classes. So, if you're going to beat me, you better be good. And there was one guy who was pretty good. But when I got to the Navy, and I spent 12 years in the Navy, I succeeded in everything I did. I won every award. I was Sailor of the Year, and ended up being a recruiter for the Navy. And when I was recruiting, that was when another revelation opened up for me. I covered 4,000 square miles, 25 high schools, and 2 colleges, including Texas A&M and Sam Houston University. And I was competing directly against the school counselors for these young people who were making decisions on what they were going to do with their lives, just like I had made a decision on what I was going to do with my life. And what I realized is that most of these kids, if not all of these kids, had the same answer when you asked them, what do you want out of life? And the answer was, I don't know. And I was thinking, how in the world can you go through all of your schooling and upbringing and get to a place where you now are being pushed out into the world and you still don't know what you want to do? And I know from my own experience that the world was harsh. We were living in 2 separate and unequal societies, and it did not care. So I cared enough to begin to mentor these young people across 25 high schools and 2 colleges. And I won every award there was in recruiting at that time. But what I learned was enough that I decided I wanted to write a book about it, to teach young Black men how to succeed in a society that wasn't built for their success. And so I was taking copious notes throughout 4 years. And when I left the Navy, I decided I was going to write a book. Again, didn't know how to write a book, just like I didn't know how to swim, but I'm going to do it. And so I ended up telling a publisher, I will sweep your floors and take out your trash if you let me work here. You don't have to pay me. 6 months later, he made me his editorial director. And from there, I started a 20-year publishing career that ended up as a New York Times Leadership Academy Fellow, that ended up taking me to Harvard, that ended up taking me to CNN as their social media expert, and ended up Dow Jones putting me in charge of newsrooms, teaching newsrooms, print-heavy newsrooms, how to become digital-first newsrooms in the 21st century. And so I was one of those innovators that led the way in teaching media how to become digital innovators, back when no one knew what social media was. And so when I left media, I became a tech entrepreneur. I started my own tech company. And then I learned another world that opened up to me. And that's the world of equity investing, venture capital, angels, and the whole economic development process that had never been exposed to me. And I knew that the reporters that I helped trained did not know anything about this world. I began writing about it. And when I began writing about it, that's when another world opened up to me. And I met Jonathan Hollyfield, who is currently the director of the White House Initiative on HBCUs. And he and I co-founded Scale Up Partners as a consultancy to create the space for what we call inclusive competitiveness. And we socialized inclusive competitiveness and built the space for inclusive competitiveness over the last 10 years. And now all 32 federal agencies of the US government now have a space for inclusive competitiveness and working with HBCUs as the landscape of developing competitiveness outcomes for people of color. And so that led to the Center for Inclusive Competitiveness at Temple University that proved the concept, and led by Dr. Jamie Bracy Green, no relation, we just have a fortunate last name. And now she is the CEO of the National Institute for Inclusive Competitiveness, and I am the Chief Economic Strategist, and we co-founded it together. There's my story. I'm sticking.
Fascinating. Fascinating. Well, my next question is, how and why did common ground conversations on race begin?
Now that's another good question. That was another revelation. So I live in Southern Oregon, and I have an interracial marriage. My wife is white, and we live in a segment of the country that out of those 74 million that voted for Trump, probably, we got a whole good chunk of them right here where I live. So when you start raising young interracial kids, biracial kids in an interracial marriage, they have a different experience. Living in a white society, they have a different experience. I did not want my kids to grow up learning about society the way I did, where you had to go through the experience of learning it, and no one actually taught that to you. So we teach our kids differently. We homeschool our kids. I'm not trusting the system that I'm surrounded by to teach my kids, because I know what they teach and I know how they teach. And so we homeschool our kids. Now our kids go to these homeschool cooperatives, and our kids impress the teachers so much. They asked my wife, what do you do? Tell us how you teach these kids. Because and where this came out was really Martin Luther King Day, where all of society does this rote exercise of Martin Luther King, I have a dream, and this superficial protocol. My kids have a deep understanding of Dr. Martin Luther King as a nonviolent warrior fighting against segregationist policies and practices that protect white supremacy to this day. Imagine that coming out of a 7, 8-year-old boy's mouth
Wow.
to a teacher. And so she wanted to know where are they getting all this information? And now they knew about Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner and white radicals and the Freedmen's Bureau and so on. So, I mean, they were teaching the teachers. So my wife was being bombarded by these questions from not only her teachers, but her sphere of friends. And so we decided together as a couple a year ago, a little over a year ago, that we would actually create a workshop on how to talk to kids about race in America. And so we did it just as an experiment to see if people would come. And sure enough, they filled it up, and they even brought their kids. And it was so successful throughout 2019 that we developed a business around it. And then, of course, COVID hit. And when COVID hit, we had to change our business model. But in every crisis, there's opportunity. And in this crisis, there was opportunity. We no longer had to get on a plane and go to audiences that were filling up our workshop. Now we could do it through Zoom. And so, and we didn't just have to talk to those who cared about speaking to kids, but we had realized over time that the problem wasn't the kids. Kids will learn anything you teach them. They're hungry for knowledge. The problem was the parents. Mm-hmm. The problem was the teachers. The problem was the influencers and policymakers in our society who are making decisions that impact people's lives and don't know their own history and don't know our history and don't know how this society construct actually operates on a daily basis. And so we decided to change the title and the name and the approach to Common Ground Conversations on Race in America, and build a platform of common information, common knowledge that leads to common understanding, that leads to productive dialogue, that leads to actionable steps toward societal change. Now notice I didn't say anything about racism in there. And when people go through our process, what they come out on the other end with is an energized understanding that they have opportunity to make societal change. They're not responsible for the society they inherited, but we are responsible for the society that we leave to future generations. So now it's our turn to determine whether or not we're going to sustain the status quo or disrupt it, redesign, reform, and reconstruct this society as an equitable, inclusive America that we can pass on to our children. Question is, how are we going to do that if we don't even know where we came from and how we got here? So that's where we develop these common ground understandings through information that is new to a lot of folks.
And my next question is, what sets these common ground conversations on race apart from other training efforts like anti-racism and racial equity?
Okay, that's a good question. It's a good question. Uh, we don't talk about anti-racism. We don't talk about anti-bias. We don't talk about all that stuff. What we talk about is human value. What we talk about is how we got here. Everybody was born in the middle of a chapter of American history, right?
Mhm.
And if you open up any book, there's lots of action, lots of intrigue going on. But if you don't go back to the beginning, you don't know how we got here. You don't really have a good contextual understanding. So we take people back through the lens of contextual history, and we teach them how. When Europeans came to this country, they came to this continent. They came to a continent filled with more than 600 nations of brown peoples who had never seen a white face. And they had a cultural understanding in this continent of shared resources, shared lands. And when the Europeans came, they brought a cultural understanding of individualism and prosperity for personal wealth. And so they came and they wanted to take ownership of lands that were shared. And so these two cultural ideas clashed along with the racism that clashed. And so we talk about individualism versus collectivism. We talk about white supremacy and racial hierarchy as all these ideals that came into this continent that did not exist here before. And so we take them through their own history of white supremacy, racial hierarchy, ownership of assets versus shared resources and collectivism. We take them to the point where there's all this violence that broke out and how violence has shaped this nation and still does to this very day. And so when they come from that, when they go through that protocol and they come out of it, they have an understanding that we are still dealing with the same issues. And the things that they learned, like the Negro American Revolution that was led by Dr. King, they never heard that before. In fact, most Black people have never heard of the Negro American Revolution, even though Dr. King wrote about it extensively, talked about it extensively, and even the federal government wrote about the Negro American Revolution and said it was the most important movement in American history, is not taught in any schools. And so the things that they learn going through our course prepares them for the kind of anti-racism, anti-bias training that they would then go through after our course. We're kind of the prerequisite, if you will.
Okay. My next question is, in the years since Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was killed, how much measurable progress has white America made toward building an equitable, inclusive society?
Very good question. Very good question. So we have to understand what the measures are. When we talk about racial equity, we don't really understand what that means to white America when we talk about equity. We know what it means to us, but we don't know what it means to white America. And I'll tell you what it means to white America. If you ask Mark Zuckerberg about equity, he's going to give you the same answer that Jeff Bezos would give you. He's going to give you the same answer that Trump would give you. He's going to give you the same answer that any white man who is an investor, who is a CEO, who is in business, understands what equity means. Equity means ownership, equitable ownership. You ever watch Shark Tank? It's about equitable ownership. When white people first arrived on this continent, it was about ownership. No, wait, no one owns this land? Everybody's sharing it? Well, we're going to own it. Equitable ownership means you own a piece of something. Equitable ownership of the American dream of prosperity is the way white people grow up in their society. We don't. We don't think about it that way. So when we get to the point of Dr. King rising up to lead this uprising, a nonviolent direct action protest that took place in nearly 1,000 cities in 1963 during the centennial of the Emancipation Proclamation, Dr. King wrote about it. He said, look, 100 years later, we're still not free. 100 years later, the Negro lives on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. 100 years later. That's the refrain from his I Have a Dream speech. He didn't start with his dream, he started with his reality. And he ended that refrain 100 years later with this. And so we've come here today to dramatize a shameful condition. That shameful condition has data points. Home ownership, Black populations have the lowest home ownership today than any other group. Our home ownership has never topped 50%. In fact, we have a home ownership today at 44%. That's roughly where it was when Dr. King was alive. We have, when we talk about business productivity, we have 2.6 million Black-owned businesses. In the last 40 years, our business startup entrepreneurship has risen like a hockey stick growth. Every year, year over year, we are constantly creating more and more new businesses. The rate of growth in entrepreneurship among Black Americans is astronomical. The productivity, the outcome, the revenues, the job growth, the productivity that comes out of that is less than 1% GDP. We're 155 years after slavery, and we produce less than 1% GDP in this country. What does that mean? It means white people do not have to worry about Black people in any way, shape, or form. You could wipe out all of our businesses. That's your Oprahs, that's your Jay-Z's, that's your everybody's, all your wealthy celebrities, all your Robert Smiths, your investors. Every Black-owned business could disappear tomorrow, and it wouldn't make a blip in our GDP. And we have the highest GDP in the world. We're the wealthiest nation. And what that means is that the contribution from Black-owned businesses is almost nothing after 155 years. And not only is that terrible, but the fact is we don't even talk about it. You can't change something you don't even know about or talk about. So now we're talking about home ownership. We talk about Black-owned businesses. Let's talk about access to capital. In the last 10 years, the banks have been fined $243 billion for discriminatory behavior toward Black folks. If you go back to Dr. King's Negro Revolution, they had 3 demands: end the segregation in schools, end discrimination in housing, and end discrimination in banking. All 3 of those are worse today, all 3. So when you talk about equitable ownership, the only way you can have equitable ownership in the American dream of prosperity is to have equitable ownership in valued assets in land, homes, businesses. This is what we can transfer as wealth to the next generation. The reason why we don't have generational wealth is because we don't talk about generational wealth. The reason why we don't have equitable ownership is because we don't talk about equitable ownership. We talk about equitable access. That's where, when we talk about racial equity, we talk about access. We want access to resources in schools. We want access to resources in society. We want to be treated fairly and equitably and equal to our white counterparts. That's the beginning of the process. We never get to the end of the process. The end of the process is equitable ownership. And so when we talk about it at the NIIC, the National Institute for Inclusive Competitiveness, we look at the end result. And then we develop the pathways to get to the end result. So if you don't have a racial pathway, a racial equity pathway to racial equity ownership, what's the end result? How do you measure it?
Wow, that's amazing. So my next question, can you share some of the challenges you've experienced in your career as a Black man? And what did you do to help you navigate those spaces?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, every Black, if you're Black in America, as James Baldwin say, if you're Black in America and you're relatively conscious, you're pretty much angry almost all the time. And that's a problem. That is a problem. Because when I first started being Black in America as a young kid, and my mama said, "You will not speak that kind of street language in my house." So she always talked above our head. So that was my first challenge. I had to learn the language to be able to speak to my own mother. So there was a dictionary. I had to use that dictionary a lot. There was a thesaurus. I had to use a thesaurus a lot because my mother understood that there are 2 things that are going to make you successful in this country. They won't make you successful, but they will give you the opportunity to be successful if you are competitive enough. Two things. One, you better be able to speak this language, because these folks really care about their language. You come in here speaking any other language, Chinese, Spanish, any other language, they will tolerate that to a degree, but they don't respect it. English is the language of money. You want to compete, you want to be successful in a capitalist country founded upon the foundation of white supremacy. You want to compete with these white guys and women, you better speak their language. That's the number one. And by the way, because all of your professions require the highest level of mastery of communications, if you want to get into any high wage profession, you better understand this language. And you better understand how to code switch, because at the end of the day, you're going to have to learn Latin, and you're going to have to learn various different industry terminologies. If you're a doctor, you got to learn industry terminologies. If you're an engineer, you have to learn industry terminologies. If you're a lawyer, you've got to learn industry terminology. So you're going to be learning language all the time, and you better know it, and you better be able to communicate with people on their level at any moment. And you can't stumble over your words because you're thinking, I have to shift from street language to the language of money. No, one's got to take precedent over the other. Now, that creates a hurdle in Black communities, because if you come out talking like a white boy, which I was accused of many, many times, a couple of things, you have to learn how to fight, because you're going to have to fight. Because the Black community did not respect, and still does not respect, the language of the white male. So that's a challenge. So if you are in one society and you're speaking the language of the other society, they clash. If I'm in the white society and I'm speaking the language of my homeboys like back at home, street language, I don't get the kind of respect. And because I walk in the door with this skin, they automatically assume that I cannot hang with their language. So if I am able to hang, then it's a surprise. So I've taken them off guard. Now they want to test my intellect. Okay, this guy can talk the game, but is he as smart as he sounds? Let's see what this guy knows. So you're constantly being tested. Wherever you go in this society as a Black man, you are constantly being tested. You are never good enough. There's no assumption that even if you have alphabets after your name, there's no assumption that those alphabets are equal to the alphabets after a white man's name. You don't get that benefit of the doubt. So the second thing you have to know in this society is math. I tell my sons all the time, math is everything. Well, math is not love. True. They are very astute kids, so they catch me at times. The point is that math teaches you logic. It teaches you critical thinking. It teaches you problem solving. Math is creativity. Even this Zoom that we're on, everything that's digital is through math. So all the algorithms that create indices, that measure things, all that's math. That measurement gives us information to make decisions. So math and language, math and English are the two main things. And guess what? If you take the SAT or ACT or whatever kind of college entrance exam you want to take, they want to know two things about you, your math and English skills.
You're absolutely right about that. So my next question, although all presidential elections are important, the recent 2020 election was said to be one of the most important elections in American history. What actions should the incoming Biden-Harris administration take to address racism in America?
Wonderful question. First of all, we have to understand who we're dealing with. So, and then I'm going to tell you what they should do, but I'll tell you who we're dealing with first. When Joe Biden ran for president, Joe Biden said he was a moderate. I'm not putting that on him, that he put that on himself. And the moment he said that, I realized this man does not know history. Dr. King excoriated moderates. And he said the white moderate might be the biggest stumbling block, more so than the Ku Klux Klaner or the citizens councils. Citizens councils are now school boards. Keep in mind that the citizens councils were the ones who kept the schools segregated. The school councils still keep the schools segregated. Remember that in 1954, Brown v. Board of Education, everybody said, whoa, the schools are going to be desegregated. They didn't realize that 4 years later, the same Supreme Court upheld the Alabama pupil placement law, which nullified Brown v. Board. Dr. King talks about this extensively. So the segregationist platform landscape in our schools still exists. The discrimination in housing still exists. The discrimination in banking still exists. Not just exists, but it's worse today than it was then. So when we talk about this white moderate, who is, by the way, a superior choice to the white supremacist that we have currently in our Oval Office, is still not the panacea. If we understand what happened right after the Civil War, when 4 million newly freed Black people came out of slavery into a hostile white nation that was built on white supremacy, that was white citizenry only. Black people were not citizens of this country. It took white radicals in Congress who prioritized the economic empowerment and political empowerment of Black people as their number one priority. It took their actions to fund a Freedmen's Bureau. It took their actions to create a 13th and 14th and 15th Amendment that disrupted the systems in order to make way for us and empower us. It took their impeachment of a white supremacist president who opposed all of that. It took their courage and their prioritizing of Black lives in a 7-year period to even give us the opportunity that we have today. Now, that was what white radicals did. And I'm not saying they're radicals, they called themselves radicals because it was a radical idea to prioritize Black lives. Imagine that. It's radical to prioritize the empowerment and the political and economic empowerment of Black people. That's a radical idea in a white nation. Today, it still is a radical idea to prioritize Black lives. We can see that society barely tolerates the Black lives. So when Biden declares himself a moderate, he fails to understand that Dr. King excoriated white moderates. Dr. King excoriated white moderates. In his book, Why We Can't Wait, he talks about the Negro Revolution. In fact, his first chapter is called The Negro Revolution, Why 1963. His 5th chapter is his letter from a Birmingham jail. In it, he excoriates white moderates and he says they are probably the biggest stumbling block he has faced, even worse than the Ku Klux Klaner and the citizens counselors. And the citizens counselors were your school boards. And the school boards were maintaining segregation as the status quo, even though the 1954 Brown v. Board of Education's SCOTUS ruling said you will desegregate with all deliberate speed. Well, that same Supreme Court also upheld the Alabama pupil placement law, which nullified Brown v. Board of Education. Most people don't even know that to this day. The reason why we continue to have segregation in schools is because of the school boards. It's because of the state education boards. Is because of the Supreme Court that upheld the Alabama pupil placement law. Now, Dr. King tells you the whole story. And he tells you that Albert Bootwell down in Birmingham, where they were staging these demonstrations to break the back of segregationist policies and practices, as Dr. King described, Albert Bootwell was one of the architects. We think of Bull Connor because of his viciousness and the dogs and the fire hoses, but Albert Bootwell was the policymaker. So at all levels of the spectrum of white supremacy, from the policy making to the media influence, all the way to the viciousness of police brutality and the vigilantes and the white supremacists who are extremists on the extreme level. We have a spectrum of white supremacy in our country. What Biden has done is placed himself in the middle. Well, if you're in the middle, you're still on the spectrum. So it doesn't, you're not telling me you're not a white supremacist. You're just telling me you're sort of a kinder, gentler white supremacist. At the end of the day, if Biden wants to affect change, and I'm talking about radical change, revolutionary change. That's why Dr. King called the Negro American Revolution a revolution, and he capitalized the R. He called his volunteers, these were army volunteers, nonviolent army volunteers. And he said in his book, we're not afraid of calling ourselves this. This is what this is. This is a war. We understand this. How come we don't understand this today? Biden doesn't understand that even though 81 million people voted for him, 74 million said no. This is still a war. This is no unification of this. One side is going to win, one side is going to lose. Right now, we have an opportunity. But Biden and Harris have to educate this nation on our own history. We cannot disrupt this supremacist landscape. We cannot disrupt the inherited segregationist policies and practices that all of us inherited. We didn't create, but we did inherit. We cannot disrupt it. We cannot redesign, reform, and reconstruct this society without knowing its history. And therefore, if you're in a position of power, if you have the ear of the nation, you have a responsibility to educate this nation on who we are, how we got here, and what will define us in the future. If we're going to be a multicultural, equitable, inclusive America, then we better do something different than what we did in the 20th century, because what we inherited was a segregationist society full of policies and practices established by white supremacists. That's what we inherited. And right now, the Claremont Institute, in full view of everyone, has held conferences that are titled Multiculturalism versus America. What does that even mean? No one's talking about that in Biden's administration. But this is a war, and the revolution is to put people in power who want to change this society. And if that change is going to come about, then Biden and Harris have a big responsibility to educate this nation.
That is an excellent point. And then my final question, Mr. Mike Green, thank you so much for joining us today. Please tell our viewers and listeners where they can go to learn more about you and the work you're doing.
Oh boy.
I don't know if it's on my end or not.
We're going to do the same question again.
Mr. Mike Green, thank you so much for joining us today. Please tell our viewers and listeners where they can go to learn more about you and the work you're doing.
Okay, well, there are two places. One is the National Institute for Inclusive Competitiveness, the NIIC, at niicusa.org. That's NIICusa.org. And the second place is the work that I do with my wife, Common Ground Conversations on Race in America, commongroundconversations.com.
Mr. Mike Green, thank you for joining us today. Please be sure to stay connected to the Black Doctor Network and connect with us on all of our social media channels. Thank you for joining us today for the Black Doctors Talk podcast. We hope you will join us again next time. But for now, be sure to like, share, subscribe, and tell a friend.